why would a Web3 company buy, a genomics company, right? And so this follows on the heels of the Sei Foundation's announcement a couple months ago, early this year. I think it was January or February. We announced a $65 million DeSci fund.
This episode is brought to you by Uphold, which is a great crypto platform that makes it easy to buy, sell, and stake crypto assets. Uphold has over 300 plus cryptocurrencies, including Bitcoin and all the top altcoins, and they offer a crypto staking on over 19 crypto assets. I've been a user of the platform for many years. They are safe and reliable. They don't commingle or lend out your crypto funds, and they are 100% reserve. You can review their transparency report. Uphold also offers an amazing rewards program where you can earn up to 5.25% on stablecoins. This rewards program also allows you to get 24-hour early access to new tokens that they list. And to participate, you just simply have to open the app once per month, deposit $50 once per month, and trade $50 once per month. And the stablecoins that they support includes Ripple's RLUSD. You can earn up to 5% on that stablecoin and 5.25% on USBC. So if you'd like to learn more about Uphold and all the great services they offer, visit the link in the description. Welcome into the Thinking Crypto podcast. I'm your host, Tony Edward, and joining me today is Gerald Gallagher, who's the general counsel for Sei Labs and a board member of the SEI Development Foundation. Gerald, great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Tony. Good to be here.
Gerald, great updates happening around Sei. So I have a lot of questions for you and all the great things you folks are doing at the labs and the foundation and much more. But let's kick it off with your background. Tell us about yourself and how'd you get into crypto?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had kind of a winding, I feel like very few people have a traditional path into crypto, but I've been full-time in the industry on the legal side for coming up on 5 years now. I started out, so I did JD MBA and was coming out of school right around when like the ICO bubble, kind of grew and then burst. And so crypto kind of initially was off the table, but I was fascinated by kind of the structuring and some of those discussions. Ended up going into what I call like the heavily regulated industries, VC, doing life, health insurance, fintech, insurtech, some of those areas. So I was in venture for about 4 years prior to making the jump full time. And then the way I actually got sort of red pilled or kind of down the orange pilled or down the rabbit hole, however you want to talk about it, is a couple of my buddies are actually the guys who started Constitution DAO. So we were living in Atlanta at the time. Shout out Graham Novak and Austin Kane hit me up and said we have this idea. We're going to buy a copy of the Constitution. And I said that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. And then they kind of took it and ran with that. The rest is history. So had kind of very early eyes on that. I was one of three attorneys. Don't want to claim too much credit for, contributing to the structure there, but was one of three attorneys basically in a Google Doc after they had raised 50 million bucks in the Juicebox wallet, trying to figure out how to go to Sotheby's and buy something with the Juicebox wallet from Sotheby's. So that was my kind of initial exposure. I had been doing a lot of like capital formation work, a lot of sort of like heavily regulated structuring. And so that was kind of the dive, and I figured out, maybe this wasn't like the project, that was going to carry me through the next 4 years, but really interesting kind of early experience, and then ended up going head of legal into another company from there. So that was kind of the beginning.
And then you're also one of the hosts on the Crypto in America podcast, right?
Yeah, so that's been a blast. I co-host that with Eleanor Terrett and Jackie Melnick, who does token relations. Obviously, we were really, really lucky to kind of steal Eleanor away from Fox. And, I can tell you that, I really admire what you do because, hosting a podcast is no joke from a commitment perspective. But, we've been really lucky to have the guests on that we've had, and, a lot of fun to work with them. So it's been good.
Yeah, I know both of them very well. And Ellie doesn't live far from me. I think she's like 15 minutes away. We met up for coffee and things like that. And I really enjoyed the conversations you three have had with your guests as well. Now, I really wanted to go back to the Constitution DAO because it just fascinates me that you can buy a
Yeah.
copy of the Constitution, and it's amazing that you set up this Web3 infrastructure to do so. And I'm not fully up to date with everything, but so the DAO still owns that document, and what's the future plans around that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So, famously, they actually lost the auction to
Oh,
Ken
yes.
Griffin, yeah, from Citadel. So he kind of came in and like rugged them at the last minute. The funny thing is, the beauty of crypto is that everything is transparent, including your balance, right? So if you're in an auction one-on-one situation with somebody else with deep pockets, they can do kind of real-time calculations. So I need to beat you by, with the fees and everything else built on top of it, I can beat you by, a dollar. And so what ended up happening with that, it was really interesting. There was a token swap from ETH to the native token, which is called People at the time. I still kind of contend I think it was like the first true like meme coin. And so gas fees at the time were really, really high. If you remember, this was like, November 2021, somewhere around there. And it was, I think basically if you put $200 into the Juicebox wallet, it was going to cost you like $200 in gas to get it out.
Mm.
So they had a redemption period saying, hey, we lost, get your ETH back. What ended up happening is a lot of people actually left their funds in there. And then the token later kind of mooned after they had, there was no Constitution DAO. It was just a sort of a wallet and a signature. And it ended up mooning like 70x or something, which I think made some people very happy, but was like obviously a really interesting experience for the team. And then I think also like it was one of the best things that could have happened to that team. They all went to really interesting roles afterwards. Some of them were obviously doing interesting things already, but yeah, it was a really interesting kind of very very bull market 2021 experience. But yeah, that was a fun time.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And, I'm still trying to learn more about DAOs and what can be done with them. Does it make sense for a podcast to create a DAO and things like that? And
Yeah.
how can it benefit the listeners and viewers? How do you see DAOs in the future? Do you see companies building them or it's more crowdsourced, decentralized type thing?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different like when you're talking about a DAO, right? Like so decentralized autonomous organization. One of the hardest parts of that has always been this misnomer of autonomous, right? A DAO cannot like really run itself. Maybe we'll see like agentic AI start to change some things in that field. For me, the interesting piece has always been the structuring. What do you wrap that around, right? Because in the US, we have general partnership, we have joint and several liability. This is how some other projects have gotten knocked in the past. So you can have something like an LLC. That was basically what ended up going to bid at Sotheby's, was an accredited investor LLC. You can have Miles Jennings and David Kerr worked really hard on this Duna structure, which is also pretty new, kind of untested. And then, there's sort of the classic kind of larger project. If you think about what a lot of these Cayman foundations do, they're a wrapper for the DAO treasury. So that's essentially you need legal protection first. And then the other thing is like, what are you going to do with the token? So if you said something like a creator sort of DAO or like a revenue share DAO, I've also done a lot of work on what's called a limited cooperative association. That's kind of a one-to-one, basically membership interest, federal securities exemption. You can distribute tokens and profits to the members of the DAO. I think we're going to see it became kind of like like an overly abused term kind of in the last cycle. And as everything's a DAO and nothing is a DAO and democracy is messy, coordination is messy. So, I think it'd be interesting where you have a group of people kind of contributing to a common asset, whether that's like a DeFi protocol or, something like a common media interest. I've seen interesting ones around like design collectives, things like that. I could definitely see something like a podcast or a set of creators creating something where, the principles line up with the way you want basically revenue or money to flow back to the users and the holders and that kind of stuff. I think it'll be interesting to see how that goes for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yeah, I'm looking to possibly explore that, but I still have a lot to learn. But I'm also thinking about how businesses can use it, maybe brands and things like that, if it makes sense. And eventually, if there's further iterations, maybe it does more unique things. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, something to explore. All right, let's talk about Sei. So tell us about Sei. What is Sei? What's its mission, and what makes it unique?
Yeah, so Sei is a layer one blockchain built on the EVM. I think we recently announced SIP to deprecate some of the CosmWasm architecture, and so we're just going to focus on the EVM now. Parallel EVM is kind of the bread and butter of Sei. It was founded, Sei Labs, the dev shop behind the Sei protocol, was founded by Jay Jog and Jeff Fang, who met each other at Berkeley. And really, honestly, was like built during the bear. A lot of grit in that team. And we have some really interesting things cooking at this point. The I guess the main idea of Sei is that you take the speed of Solana and you combine it with the basically dev environment of Ethereum. So that's kind of the goal there.
Got it. And what type of protocol does it have? Is it, like you have proof of stake, proof of authority? What protocol does it use? And, does that help with the decentralization and the speed as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one is it is a proof of stake network. And then two is that decentralization question is really interesting. So Sei is decentralized at this point. There are about 40 validators. Um, the idea of decentralization is interesting just because I spend a lot of time on the sort of the policy side of that, and I think if you ask 30 lawyers to define decentralization for you, you're going to get 30 different answers. There's been a lot of work done recently for the market structuring bill on like whether or not there's control of one party over the network. So Say definitely has a big focus on decentralization. And I think the goal is to just make sort of the cheapest, highest throughput chain, possible and explore all the applications that can enable.
Yeah, for sure. And speed is such a big factor for adoption. I mean, consumers, they want things to be done at a click of a button. They want low transaction fees. And I've noticed that, Solana took a lot of market share from Ethereum, not, certain types, and maybe not enterprise, but just consumer interacting with different users, being able to make quick applications. So I think the fastest blockchains, and I don't think it's just going to be one, but multiple, will be the ones that get the real world adoption and power this Web3 infrastructure.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. Solana, was this kind of like alt side chain, back in when I'm sure, when since you and I have been in the industry, it obviously went through kind of the FTX drama and everything associated with that. But it used to get ragged on a lot. And so, full transparency, I also I was one of my first jobs as GC and CEO of a company that spun out of Solana Labs. And so, definitely a lot of respect for what they've built. I think you hit on an important point, which is Solana's moat, I think, to this point has been Rust. So if you got into Solana in sort of the previous bull, and you force yourself to eat glass, as they say, and learn Rust, and then the bottom fell out or your app didn't work, well, you've learned Rust. Like you put all this effort into it. You're not going to go to another chain. You're just going to build something else on Solana. And so obviously it came back. It's got a very sticky dev community. And I think one of the challenges that Ethereum has had is there was the L2s, right? And there were a lot of very interesting applications. I think there's a lot of very interesting academic work that's been done there. But now there seems to be a big refocusing, particularly in this kind of EVM space that we occupy, on building things for the consumer, building things that are fast, that actually work, that users can use, right? Which is obviously important. And then having the dev community be able to sort of jump and build, what they want is I think an advantage that'll hopefully play out long term for builders of the EVM.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I noticed that with the recent upgrade around Ethereum and just a realignment of focus, back on getting utility on the layer one versus all these layer two rollups. I mean, there's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
many I can
L3s, L4s, yeah, let's L it all. Yeah, yeah. No, it's an interesting time for sure.
for
Yeah.
sure. And then so for per se, and as an L1, I'm assuming you're targeting tokenization and different use cases. Are there particular industries that you're looking to maybe find a swim lane in, or is just across the board?
Yeah, so I think when you're building low fee, high TPS, right, you want to attack use cases that need to utilize those features, right? And so I think finance, those types of areas, you could say AI, decentralized computing in general, obviously needs to be able to enact very like cheaply and quickly. But things like tokenization are obviously super important. I guess the sort of new rails, and I have this debate with a lot of people about whether we're going to get more exposure for traditional assets to be tokenized, right? So whether, JP Morgan stock is going to be built on, the back of something like Say, or whether we're going to continue to get more sort of crypto exposure into mainstream markets, right? So the ETFs and some of those areas. But for Say, the focus right now is definitely finance. I think we're going to talk a little bit about DeSci,
Mhm.
um, AI, and a lot of those use cases, that need architecture that can do what we do.
Oh, for sure. So speaking of DeSci, and it's funny because you can also maybe say sci-fi,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
There's news of say potentially acquiring 23andMe. What can you tell us there? And if you are able to acquire this company, what would the use cases and utility be built around this?
Yeah, for sure. So I have to be careful here, just because of where we are in the process, if we are involved in the process, right? So no, I'll just kind of comment on what's publicly available, and then obviously, would love to talk about sort of where somebody could go with that, or a vision for a DeSci project like that. So yeah, 23andMe went into bankruptcy proceedings, I think maybe a month and a half ago now. Don't quote me on that date, but and that was actually after a long kind of process of seeing if they could find an acquirer. I know the founder was trying to pull a bid together. It doesn't look like that worked out, and so the company ended up in kind of Chapter 11 world. So when a company goes into bankruptcy, there's this very sort of long process, and it's very procedural, where everybody kind of digs in and looks at the assets, and this is just how bankruptcy procedure works more broadly. Everybody kind of digs around and says, okay, well, I want the domain name, I want the this business, I want the that business. And so Say basically put out that, we'd be interested in the company. Why would a Web3 company buy, a genomics company, right? And so this follows on the heels of the Say Foundation's announcement a couple months ago, early this year. I think it was January or February. We announced a $65 million DeSci fund,
Hmm.
because that was a big bet on a space that I think went through a time where it probably got overly DAO'd. I think that's, to our conversation about DAOs, everything was going to be a DAO and everything was going to solve a disease. Um, it sort of went through this phase. It got really buzzwordy, and then I think the biggest thing that probably happened there was FDA clearance sort of timelines do not align with token holder expectations,
Oh yeah.
right? It's like just the mechanics of sort of true scientific applications versus expectations in a bull market for liquidity and things like that just really don't line up. And to provide a little more context here, I mentioned sort of the health stuff. My last job before I joke, my last real job, my last job before I went down the rabbit hole in crypto. I was at a venture fund, HealthWorks, funded by Care First, Blue Cross Blue Shield. I've done like some corp dev in like the biopharma world, and so I've been really passionate about this space for like a while. So the company basically continued to go through that process. And now the auction is May 14th, and that's obviously publicly available. Why would a crypto company be interested in that? Well, if you look at traditional healthcare, it's one of the least efficient technology industries with probably the greatest economic impact on the United States, right? So this number is going to be a couple years old, but America spends something like $4.5 trillion a year on healthcare and health services, and that's out of a GDP of something like 21, 22 trillion, right? So we're spending nearly a quarter of our resources on healthcare, and the outcomes are not improving. So we're spending more money than anyone and we have worse outcomes than anyone. The reason is that the system is incredibly extractive, right? There's a saying kind of it plays more to like social media and things like that. But, if you're not paying, like you are the product. And so we have a duopoly in the electronic health record market, which is Epic and Cerner. There's no interoperability there. The government, puts out standards every few years. We recently had FHIR, which is an interoperability standard. And it's really like has not had an impact. So when you go into the doctor's office, everybody's been to the same doctor, a new doctor, and you fill out that piece of paper again,
Yeah.
right? And so one of the early applications that crypto looked at was, well, let's just put everybody's health records on, on chain. And what you find out is that the interoperability or the systems that where you need to integrate with like pharmacy benefit managers, you need to integrate with payers, providers, like there's all these different parties. You need the government to be able to know what's happening. It's really, really hard. It's a big complex system. Well, if you take that and then you combine the problems with DeSci, which is that there's a huge cold start problem, right? So I say I want to solve let's like hair DAO. That's a real DAO, right? That basically
Mhm.
wants to solve hair loss and things like that. So they do some novel capital formation, and then they want to go solve this condition specific disease. Well, you have to go get all the data on that condition, right? And so I kind of instantly need a big pool to start pulling from so that I can actually have researchers interact with that. I can develop therapeutics. I can do all that kind of stuff. If you took, let's call it, I think publicly it's something like 14 million, genomic records. You can assume that some people started deleting their data. You can assume that all that data is not perfect. So let's call it something like 8 million health records, right? That's a bigger starting point than any DeSci project has ever had in
Mhm.
terms of being able to actually use and interact with high validity data. So the interesting thing is, if you were to build like a big DeFi or a DeSci, kind of call it like a data lake, right?
Mhm.
You could do a lot of interesting things where you're building not only with the legacy data, but also new data sets and kind of other inputs. So, patient records, things like that. If you could have users submit that data, and you end up with this baseline. Then you can go to these therapeutics companies, you can go to AI drug discovery, you can go to clinical research organizations, and you can have this really high integrity compliant data because it turns out that storing things on chain actually is pretty secure. And so that's kind of the interesting thing about building with a data set or something like that. Is you end up I don't know if this analogy fits like one to one, but just again, coming out of the Solana ecosystem, Helium moved over to Solana in the middle of the bear, right?
Mhm.
And that didn't seem like a huge deal to a lot of folks at the time, but it was actually enormously impactful on DePIN on Solana
Right.
because you had an actual IoT provider. You had somebody who had actually gone out and done all the contracts and gotten all the, permissioning and actually built the hardware and all that. So it's been very hard for other chains to replicate that kind of base layer, right? If I want to build like a Hive mapper or like a 3D rendering software, I'm not going to go to a chain that obviously, say would love to support more deepen projects. It's a very interesting real world use case. But that advantage that they had was really powerful coming into the last cycle. And so if you could build something like that, like a Helium, but for health data, that's an incredibly impactful thing because now you are the base layer of what anyone wants to build. Oh, you want to build your therapeutic for your hair thing. Oh, you want to go try to do a fitness rewards program. Well, here's this starting point, and then you can just ingest this data and use it, in a way that also kind of shares the economics in a very, Web3 way with everyone who's interacting with that data.
Mm. Well, I, for one, would love to see blockchain Web3 integrated into the healthcare industry. To your point of going to different doctors and not having to fill out all those forms over and over again.
Yeah.
And then, of course, having your data secure. And then eventually, if Web3 is giving us ownership of our data, having that, and I can choose who I want to release it to, I can monetize it. There could be a lot of benefits here, and obviously improving the efficiency between different institutions and labs and much more. That would be really great.
Yeah, and I mean, data sovereignty is a huge piece of it, right? Like, we talk all the time about, giving the economics and the control over data back to the people, and you really need to mechanically be able to do that, right? It's one thing to say, oh yeah, like, you're a creator and I pay you these streaming fees and that's all yours, but I can still shut down that AWS server anytime I want, right?
Right.
And so actually returning access and control of that data to users is would be incredibly impactful.
Mm. So, a 23andMe aside, I'm assuming you're approaching different folks in the healthcare industry, laboratories, and much more, and looking to, get them to utilize the Sei blockchain.
Yeah, I think we're still in really early innings there. We did hire a great head of DeSci, Eleanor Davies, who comes with a great background, a lot of relationships there. We have folks like myself and others on the team that have those relationships in sort of traditional healthcare. I think there's still an enormous learning curve. Like if I were to compare it where we are now, even though it's been something that people have been working on for several years, we're probably in, maybe like 2016, 70 for 16, 17 for like the way payments eventually onboarded to crypto, right? We had to go through kind of the everything is fintech cycle. And then, okay, you can do stuff on chain. And then, okay, now Visa is signing deals with, now we've got basically everybody has, rain cards, another great example. I think there had to be this transition to where not only does the industry get it, but the tech works well enough. And so I think we're just kind of finally coming into that phase. And, maybe over the next like 5 to 6 years, we'll see some real integrations there.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about that because I've been like monitoring different industries, like the real estate industry. What's happening? Are they integrating blockchain and looking at what the folks at Property are doing? Obviously, you got the DeSci and then DePIN and much more, and you're seeing the move, but it's going to take years. It's not something that can happen overnight, of course.
Yeah, I think it's the industry goes through these phases of getting really, really excited about novel ways to solve a problem, right? And so I compare that's kind of like they're obviously brilliant people, but sort of like the Stanford, Blockchain Institute kind of ZK crowd. It's like you get this really, really deep academic research and like that is fascinating. Nobody knows what to do with that.
Right.
And then you go, so in the next step, and it's like, okay, well, the system does work, right? Like I remember, I think I read something recently about the basically like the fax machine would never die because it was so efficient.
Yeah.
And it's like that's, it takes time for us to go from like DARPA and, like 4 universities building the internet, to actually, the AOL, the little guy like running across the screen, having to unplug your phone line to plug it in. A lot of people don't remember that phase of the internet, but that happened.
Yep.
To, now obviously we're all walking around with, more tech than, sent men to the moon in our pocket. So yeah, I hate it's like become such a cliche at this point, but like we are still so early. Like it's a really interesting time.
Yeah, for sure. I often compare like where we're at as far as timeline with an analogy of dial-up to broadband,
Yep.
right? And then eventually mobile networks, and it took what 30 years to get there,
Yeah. Yeah. No,
25, 30 years.
it's a slow grind. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So, what's on your roadmap for the remainder of the year?
Good question. Yeah. So I think what's top of mind is the podcast. So crypto in America is continuing to expand. We obviously had Vlad Tenev from Robinhood on. Um, I believe that episode came out last week, and we're very excited about the guests that we're having on, and with Sei continuing to build that brand and that community. For Say specifically, I think it's going to be an interesting time on the DeSci front, depending on how I guess the next few weeks or months here work out. We're going to keep trying to build with founders and applications in that space. We have a lot of interesting stuff going on in I think we're almost ready, on the agentic AI front to see some interesting stuff come out there. I know that it's kind of it feels a little hobbyist to me right now, but I think once you start really having agents that you can deploy and build on, that's going to be exciting. And then obviously also we're just kind of watching the markets to see, what's going to happen here because what we would love to see is a lot more a lot more founders and a lot more builders launching things on Say and getting to those kind of big interesting company levels. And so we're just excited to see what builders come build, and that's really what's fun about it for us.
Oh, for sure. So I wanted to get your thoughts on, what's happening overall in the crypto market. You obviously being an OG, being here for a long time, what are your thoughts on how this asset class has grown? We've seen a big change in the government, more favorable to crypto. TradFi is here. I mean, they're hitting the ground running, tokenizing, doing all types of things, launching ETFs and much more. What are your thoughts on how the market has matured?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are people who are a lot smarter than me on this, but I'll try to give my 2 cents here. I think Bitcoin, like as Bitcoin goes, the world goes. That's been the story for the last kind of decade. And if you also look at where Bitcoin was going, it seems like it was pretty. Obviously we had kind of the not super cycle, but sort of these 4-year cycles. And then other than that, it's really been heavily correlated as of late to kind of the Nasdaq and the S&P 500. So, people have been talking about Bitcoin as digital gold for a long time. And I think recently we've started to see that deviation a little bit, right? So you had kind of turmoil from the tariffs and some of the other sort of market volatility. Bitcoin actually not suffering the way you would expect to see it in a traditional macro environment. So that's been really interesting. Um, I think we're also starting to get some clarity on where the administration wants to go from a market perspective. I think England signed a deal. The president, I think today is in Saudi Arabia doing a bunch of interesting kind of economic development work. Um, and I think for the broader industry, you mentioned the institutions are finally here, right? We had a founder on the Crypto in America podcast recently, and I think you also recently spoke to Bo Hines. There was a great quote from Bo when he hung out with us on Crypto America, which is, what would you say to founders? And he said, welcome home, right? And so you combine that with a thing another founder said to us, which was, we won. Like the institution, they're here. And so I think the last 3 months probably feels like 3 years, for anybody who's really tracking things closely. But I'm really excited to see the amount of not only liquidity that, TradFi brings into the space, but I also hope we just really don't like replicate that structure. I think they're going to have some really interesting kind of product ideas, and you're going to get some of these interesting crypto folks in the same room with people who understand market, liquidity and volatility. Have been doing this for 30 or 40 years. That's one thing that the crypto industry has always kind of lacked is they by nature of the industry, there is nobody who's been doing this for 30 or 40 years.
Right.
So, I'm excited to see the maturity and then I think also the regulatory clarity. So if we can get stablecoin legislation, market structuring legislation passed by August, which is goalposts that the president's executive order set out. We're going to have a lot of folks who are sitting on the sidelines or are thinking about going overseas get really comfortable building here, and I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned, stablecoin and crypto legislation. Boy, I'm hoping we get that done this year. That would be huge for the market. We'll continue the momentum, and sometimes government moves slow. They get in their own way. They mudsling, of course. But if we can get that bipartisan support and Trump signs it into law, that would be huge. I mean, the amount of innovation, jobs, wealth that'll be created, it'll be huge. Kind of like the internet bill in 1996, I think, with Bill Clinton and stuff like
Yep.
that.
Yeah, I think it's the same. I've heard it compared to that. That's the Telecommunications Act, and then also on the market structuring side, like Dodd-Frank,
Mhm.
right? It's like one of these things. Stable coins should be a no-brainer. I know there's some fine-tuning needed around. There's concerns on KYC, AML, some of the concerns that have been, plaguing the industry for a long time. Those seem to be largely addressed. And then, yeah, I mean, really, it's off to the races with stables. One of the best quotes I heard recently was, if that passes, we're going to have USD A to Z. We're going to have everybody wants to be able to do instant settlement and liquidity in US dollars, right? And that's how the global economy should run. So you get stable coins done, and then on the market structuring side, it's like every kind of, I forget if it was a staff or a member, somebody on the Hill was telling me, it's like once a decade we get a shot at like real legislation, right? Like real financial reform. And so the crypto industry has been relying on the same rules that securities, attorneys were relying on in the 30s and 40s. Right. So like not even once a decade. Like let's go for once a century. Let's upgrade some of these laws to actually interact with the modern financial system. And so like you said, I think the mudslinging, it's obviously, you would be silly to not recognize like the hyper partisan nature of the United States right now. Crypto should be a nonpartisan issue.
Mhm.
And so I think it's just reality to know that, we need to update, some of the guidance and some of the laws we have because frankly, like, there were some, I mean, it's a lot of it is sort of being not brought to light, but it's being discussed, in an open way. I think within the government, even if you talk about sort of Gensler's approach and the last administration's approach to things like Operation Choke Point and other aspects that I think really the goal was just to hope that crypto just kind of died and
Yeah.
just sort of went away. Oh, it'll just kind of eat itself and spiral, and we don't really need to worry about it. And that's clearly not the case. Like we're not going anywhere. It reminds me of that meme, like first time, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's we can ride it out. So very enthusiastic about hopefully getting something codified into law here that we can rely on for longer than one administration. That would be nice.
So, Gerald, you're saying, I can't believe you're saying this, that, tokens on decentralized networks distributed globally can't be, managed the same way as orange grows in Florida.
Unfortunately not. It's really surprising that, yeah, if you and I have never met and I've never made a promise to you that, somehow that's not the same as me selling you an orange grove. So, yeah, it's where we're at. Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. All right, good stuff, Gerald. I got some wrap-up questions here for you. First,
absolutely.
if you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be?
My own metaverse. So, I think that I would love to do something. I grew up one of the first things I wanted to do was be an astronaut. I wanted to go to space camp and all that. And I read too much sci-fi, watch too much sci-fi. So let's go intergalactic with it. Yeah, space. Yeah,
Nice. That would be mine too. I love all things Star Wars and things like that.
yeah.
Rapid fire questions. Favorite food?
Favorite food, man. You can't go wrong with a good mac and cheese. And it can be, there's a thousand different ways to do it. I grew up in the
Mhm.
Southeast, we need cream cheese instead of butter. Some people do the crumbs on it. I don't mind. You want to add some things to it, maybe some taco meat, maybe some lobster, but yeah, mac and cheese.
Lobster mac and cheese for sure. That is one of my favorites. Favorite musician or band?
Yeah, I grew up on Red Hot Chili Peppers, so let's go. Yeah, I've seen them a couple times live. I can't believe those guys are still doing it. So yeah, Chili Peppers.
Yeah, they're one of my favorite bands. I actually play guitar. One of the reasons I started to play guitar because I heard John Frusciante play, and I'm like, okay, I gotta
Yeah,
get
I
in.
love everybody knows that riff that in snow, like Californication or Snow from the newer album comes on. Everybody it's everybody knows that sound.
For sure. Favorite movie?
Favorite movie. So I grew up a big Guy Ritchie fan. I think it's like one of the most just kind of guy things about me. And so the movie Snatch, they came out back in I want to say it was like oh 04, oh 05, but it was a great movie, incredible cast. Brad Pitt, Jason
Oh,
Statham.
yeah.
That was a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, Brad is amazing in that because at first I thought the movie was like going to be slapstick comedy or something like
Yeah.
because just like Brad Pitt doing this, and then I watch him like, oh wow, this is just so good.
Yeah. That was a
Uh,
good one. Yeah.
Favorite book?
Favorite book. Um, so I actually got this one from a Tim Ferriss recommendation. And I've been meaning to reread it. I love reading. You can see I got these, the full shelves back there behind me. I hope I don't misquote the title. I think it's called Lion Tracker's Guide to Life.
Hmm.
It's not it's only about that thick, but it is just packed. It's by this basically entrepreneur who went back to South Africa and the whole story is kind of an entrepreneurial sort of self-help journey, but told through this journey that he's taking, tracking this like single pride of lions, and it's a good read. Yeah.
Interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
And when you're not working at Say, what are you doing for fun?
I got to be outside or I got to play sports, man. I play pickup basketball. I think kind of every opportunity I get, and yeah, it's just good to get out there and get some fresh air, given that we're staring at screens like this about 90% of the time. So
Oh, dude, I was literally in the gym yesterday playing pickup.
nice. Yeah,
I'm
no, it's
only like
great.
5'8", but I have a good vertical and I've been playing since high school. So it's just the best. That's
There you
how I,
go.
yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
well, Gerald, absolute pleasure. I love the updates that are happening on Say, and I have to have you back on, and as things progress, and maybe some big news coming out with Say and acquisitions and much more. But thank you
Mhm.
so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Tony. I really enjoyed it.